Hi, I'm Marcus Fayers, founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, and welcome to day 11 of Dezeen 15, a digital festival celebrating Dezeen's 15th birthday. We asked 15 creators from around the world to come up with ideas for how to change the world over the next 15 years. Each day, they'll all be presenting their manifestos for a better world. Today, we're speaking to curator Aric Chen about his proposal. Hi, Aric.
Hey, Marcus.
And I just realized you said that not to describe you as a curator. So how would you describe yourself?
Well, I am a curator, but more recently, I am the recently appointed General and Artistic Director of Het Nieuwe Institute, or the New Institute in Rotterdam, which is sort of like the Dutch National Institute and Museum for Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture, which I'll say a little bit more about later.
And are you speaking from Rotterdam now? Looks like you could be speaking from the Antarctic, actually. It looks very cold and mysterious wherever you are.
It is a little bit chilly, but I'm not sure what it's like in London, but yeah, we have a bit of that vibe here right now.
So tell us a bit more about yourself then and your current job.
Sure. Well, I am an American curator, started out in media, actually, when I was living in New York. But for the past 13 years, I was living in China, first Beijing, where I was creative director for Beijing Design Week, then Hong Kong, where I was lead curator for M+, which is the new, lead curator for design and architecture at M+, which is the new museum that just opened last week, finally, in Hong Kong. And then after that, I was in Shanghai, before, from where, among other things, I was curatorial director for Design Miami, but now, as of September 1st, I've been full-time here in Rotterdam.
Okay, and as you say, your manifesto touches on the work that the Institute does and is going to do. So maybe this is a good time for you to share your presentation and tell us about your big idea.
Sure, let's do that. Now, yeah, so first of all, thank you, Marcus, for inviting me to be part of this epic Dezeen 15 initiative, and for asking me to present a manifesto. Now, as you know, I kind of cheekily use my manifesto to call for the death of manifestos. And I'll explain why that is, because when we're talking about designs for the future and how we might address the litany of crises that we face as a species, as a planet, as one species among many, I think it's worth sort of questioning whether manifestos are really the way to go, because as I write, we could argue that manifestos are, sorry, are you seeing my next image? Yeah. Yep. Because we can argue that manifestos, or at least the mentality of the manifesto, is part of what got us into the mess that we're in. That is to say, this sort of idea of totalizing visions, or these sort of edicts of belief that with such certainty tell us if only such and such, the world would be a better place, or our problems would be solved, has sort of misled us towards the state that we're in which not just human-centric, but certain types of human-centric, including colonial worldviews, as well as the mentalities that and ideologies that gave us, unfortunately, many of the failures of modernism that we're all too aware of, have led us to the kinds of social, ecological, and other crises that we're facing. This idea that we can impose not just the Cartesian grid, but Cartesian ways of thinking onto a world that is much more complex than that. So, of course, nowadays we aren't as ideologically driven, as we were in the 20th century, the sort of heyday of the manifesto. But its sort of more current iteration has still, nevertheless, I would argue, brought us to too many distractions, where we are led to believe that there are solutions to problems that are in fact too complex to be solved. And so what I think other of your manifesto writers have been saying, and many other people, is that we can't rely on these kinds of unifying logics anymore. And in fact, what we need to do is acknowledge that we live in a world in which there are multiple multiplicities of often contradictory logics that are operating at the same time, and that we need to sort of find ways of using those different logics, drawing from different knowledges and different perspectives, both human and non-human, in order to cumulatively tackle the complexities of the issues that we face. And so, by definition, I'm not here to sort of proffer any, solutions or prescriptions of what we need to do, but rather what I'm saying is that we all need to act in different ways, depending on the situation, depending on the conditions in which we are acting. And so what I can do as part of the brief you gave me is perhaps speak in particular on the role of the cultural institution, given that that's where I'm working right now, and in particular, the one where I just started 2 months ago, the new institute here in Rotterdam. Now, a very quick introduction for those who may not be familiar with the new institute. It was formed 8 years ago from the merger of 3 existing institutes, the Netherlands Architecture Institute, the Premzela Design Institute, and also the virtual e-culture platform, thus making us the Dutch National Institute for Architecture, Design, and Digital Culture. We hold the Dutch National Archive for Architecture and Urbanism. We commission the Dutch Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale, but at the same time, we are a very much research-driven organization that has done a lot of work in recent years in the sort of speculative realm, looking at issues ranging from biomaterials to automated landscapes and more than human practices, and so on and so forth. Now, like other cultural institutions, I think we have a very strong social orientation, always sort of questioning what our social relevance is. And like other cultural institutions, what we've been doing in tackling all the social, ecological, and systemic crises and urgencies that we face that probably don't need to be repeated is we, research it, we've speculated, we've posed questions, we've raised awareness. And it's my belief and our belief that all of these things are very important exercises, but frankly, we are out of time to simply be researching, speculating, posing questions, and raising awareness. So what do we do now? And so we're going to be shifting our emphasis a little bit more towards becoming a testing ground for a lot of the ideas, not just that we, but of course the entire design discipline has been proffering for years, to kind of examine the threshold between speculation and the current reality, to not only show, display, and interpret different narratives, but to actually produce them, to kind of go for what you might call a sort of enacted speculation in order to stress test many of the ideas that have been floating around, and not just ideas, but approaches that have been floating around in recent years. So just to make this concrete, I'm going to, I'll just sort of briefly describe a few of the ways in which we are trying to do this. As I mentioned, we have a collection that dates back several hundred years. And in terms of content, it's almost 100 years in terms of its existence. And like others, we are, trying to revisit the narratives that we're able to tell through that collection. So we've been adding more, feminist and queer stories into the collection. Also stories about informal architecture, like an archive of squatting that was recently included in the collection. But at the same time, as we collectively go through this process of critiquing and unpacking the way histories have been told, this whole notion of decolonization is very much part and parcel of that. I think we can also begin to ask what comes after the critique and the unpacking. Once we still need to continue the research and of course raise awareness about how histories were created oftentimes to the exclusion or even through the oppression of others. But then, where do we go from there? And so we're looking to begin to not just speculate, but also enact speculations about what retroactive decolonized histories might look like in the future. One of our researchers, Klaas Keitenbrouwer, has over the past few years been developing this notion of a Zoöp. And basically what this is a framework for bringing non-human voices and interests into organizational decision-making processes as a way of instilling more equitable and also ecologically regenerative practices into various organizations. And we just announced recently that in the first half of next year, we will become the world's first Zoöp, and this involves a whole sort of process of instituting an observer designating an observer board seat in our organization for these kinds of perspectives to be brought in dialogue with a Zoöp Institute and Zoöp Foundation, independent Zoöp Institute and Foundation that are being formed to kind of monitor our progress and give feedback, and also develop a network of Zoöps that can serve as a kind of clearinghouse for sharing knowledge and experiences. The idea is that the Zoöp model can be applied to all sorts of organizations, from big to small, public to private, for-profit to nonprofit. And there are already a number of other organizations that have expressed interest in becoming Zoöps, and we hope there will be more. Now, in the more immediate sort of in as immediate a time frame, a time scale, our pond and garden, you can see the pond here and the garden sort of around the corner, are currently being retrofitted and also redesigned in a transitional way to follow Zoöp principles, but also which also includes ideas about multi-species urbanism. So hopefully that'll be done next spring, and we'll be able to show how that process evolved in real life, in a real space, through this kind of Zoöp methodology. We also announced recently that next fall, we will be the host and co-organizer of the inaugural Solar Biennial, which is an initiative that's been launched by the designers Marianne van Albel and Pauline van Dongen. You see here an image of Marianne's recent solar installation at the Dutch Pavilion at the World Expo in Dubai, which has been covered on Dezeen. I think it may have even gotten one of your awards, Marcus, if I'm not mistaken. But this Solar Biennial is not going to be a kind of showcase of utopian silver bullets, right? But rather it's meant to take a more multi-perspectival look at the kind of social and cultural implications of the energy transition that we need, while also, we hope, informing us as we look to make our building more sustainable in the future. And we are going to be testing the potentials of solar in our own building, on our own site, in the famously sunless Rotterdam autumn and winter. So we really want to kind of get away from again, this sort of notion that we have these easy answers that work in theory, when reality, of course, is much more complex. We've just begun investigating our store. As an institution, we have a store. Lots of cultural institutions rely more and more on stores as revenue generators, but this is coming at a time when a lot of designers have been questioning their role in the sort of extractive systems of consumption and production that are very much at the root of our ecological problems. And so the question with the store that we're investigating is, rather than just sort of making stuff to sell it, can we actually bring in a lot of the work of these designers, the propositions of these designers, and help develop them? These propositions that question notions of consumption and exchange, and also how we generate value in other than capitalist ways, and can we test them within what is still a market system. And so this is something that we're working on now, and hopefully we'll be able to have more to say about it next year. And then, this is just one example that we've already instituted. This is a bag of upcycled bags that are not given away to customers, but actually put out on loan. We will be this is just one very sort of simple example. Of course, we'll be going much deeper and exploring these kinds of questions in much more systemic ways. And then last but not least, we've also begun looking at how we can experiment with co-creation in order to instill, not just instill, but also, well, not just include, but instill a diversity of voices and perspectives into everything we do. And we're just at the very early stages of this. But I guess the question is, if we're talking about multivocalities and inclusiveness, how can that work into our systems, our own processes of creating content and operating as a cultural institution? So these are just a few propositions that we're working on in becoming a testing ground for ideas that have been around there for a while, and we will of course see how they go and also share what we learn.
Thanks very much, Aric. And from starting off by provocatively saying you weren't going to write a manifesto, it did actually sound very much like a manifesto.
Oh, totally.
At least a manifesto for what you're going to do with your institute. And there's a lot going on. Sounds great. Tell me about the Zoöp thing, though. I didn't quite get exactly what that's all about. You talk about bringing in non-human voices. How does that work, and what are those non-human voices?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I guess a way of putting it is taking what we already know to sort of the next level, right? I think we all know that any sort of place or space is not just for humans, but there are a lot of symbiotic and mutually dependent relationships going on. So this is everything, from if we're looking at our garden, from the birds and insects that inhabit it, to of course the plants and fauna and the sort of life cycles that they go into, that they go through, and how those sync with those of the birds and insects, to the microbes in the soil and their critical role in allowing all the others to sort of thrive. So with the Zoöp, it's just a way of structurally ensuring that we take all of these sort of needs and needs into account. So it's a kind of, there's been a lot of talk, and there's been a big movement around the rights of nature, right? So granting natural entities, even bodies of water, legal rights as a way of ensuring that they're protected. And this is not some kind of new agey new agey fantasy. I mean, there are Ecuador and Colombia famously have embodied some of these rights in their constitutions. It's really kind of creating a legal framework, and this is a way of doing this on an organizational level.
So how would those non-human voices be represented then?
So there will be a representative appointed and trained by the Zoonomy Foundation, which is an independent entity that is being established now, and that representative will have a seat on our board, on our board of directors,
to argue the point of view of the natural world and
Yeah, and to sort of give guidance, just this morning, we have on this ramp towards our sort of back entrance of the institute, there's a kind of there are these rods that sort of that are mounted above them, and there are a number of pigeons who like to roost there, and as a result, we have these two kind of piles of, what, let's say, pigeon leftovers that sort of like accumulate there, and unfortunately sometimes drop on people as they walk by. So instead of just kind of shooing the pigeons away, or putting these awful kind of nails and whatever on those rods to kind of prevent them from being there, sort of what are the other options? We can sort of talk about putting planting beds, but beneath them, because the pigeon droppings are actually quite good for the soil, or we find ways of luring the pigeons to other places in our garden. It's just sort of simple things like that.
I've had a few conversations recently about biophilic design, and one issue with certain manifestations of that is that the natural world, bringing plants into the interior, for example, is all about making it better for humans, but it doesn't really take into account what it's like for the plants. They seem to get a bit of a bad deal out of it.
Yeah, and I want to stress that I realize that some of this might sound a little bit strange, to some people, like we're sort of anthropomorphizing, these other entities, but in some ways that's kind of the point. Again, that this is not some sort of new agey sort of mystical thing. It's really about taking steps and doing exercises to sort of change our frames of reference, and to change our worldview in the way that we need to, in order to ensure that we have a habitable planet for all of us in the future.
And as you alluded to in your talk just then, the design world has been talking for a long time about moving beyond this kind of consumptive model. In a way, you could argue that design was invented to help consumption, or to produce objects for consumption. And we've noticed that, particularly in the Netherlands, that students for 10-15 years already have not wanted to be the next Philippe Starck, but have wanted to help pioneer new materials and new processes and new ideas and things like that. Are we going to reach a tipping point soon where design is no longer about producing objects for consumption? Are we there? Is that desirable even? And instead is part of this field of, I take your point that we don't need speculation anymore, we need action, but is design able to shift into that kind of mode of operation?
Yeah, I think it totally is. I mean, and this goes back to my sort of anti-manifesto manifesto. As you put it, it's not either or one or the other. We will always need objects, but the question is, how do we produce those objects? How do we consume those objects? And I think, as you say, the sort of younger generation of designers has shown us that there's a lot of reason to be hopeful, because they are really thinking in the terms that we need to rethink things in the ways that we need to.
And you mentioned decolonialization, colonialism, and that's something that's cropped up, I think, more than any other topic in the talks we've done as part of this Dezeen 15 festival. Can you talk a bit more about that? Is that partly through a kind of colonial guilt of the architecture and design system, that it feels like it has somehow helped perpetuate this kind of inequality?
Yeah, I think that sounds about right to me. But I think I think as disciplines, we are for sure seeing our complicity in it. I don't think we need to sort of take our guilt so far that we're just sort of flagellating ourselves all the time. But I think now that we acknowledge our complicity, what I love about design and architecture is that these are inherently sort of optimistic disciplines, and they're disciplines that are always about that are also highly ethical disciplines, in the sense that it's always about making things better, however one defines better. And that's the sort of crucial question: what does better mean, and for whom are things better? But I think we're aware of these nuances now, and again, that's why we're seeing so many really compelling ideas and reflections coming from designers these days.
And also, you mentioned a few areas of exploration. You mentioned like queer design, you mentioned biomaterials, the solar stuff you're doing. Are there any other kind of topics that you think are going to become increasingly important, whether or not the Institute is going to be talking about those? What are other emerging fields are there that might be on the radar if someone's coming into design now, for example?
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of endless, isn't it? But I think, you know, we just had an interesting conversation the other day about not just the role of digital culture at the Institute, but really how digital culture has both evolved and almost dissipated as a field. And what I mean by that is that the digital has become so pervasive that it's almost become invisible, right? And so at this point, when we have the conversations around Facebook and surveillance capitalism and big data and AI and so on and so forth that we're having, maybe now is a good time to kind of revisit what we mean by digital culture and what its fuller implications are. And this is especially a conversation in the Netherlands, because here, the Netherlands is really pioneering in exploring the ramifications and possibilities, and also potential cautionary tales around the digital back in the 1990s. And I think right now here we are looking at where things stand now, and it seems like a good time to be revisiting all of that.
Yeah, I suppose the digital world is kind of sort of eaten the physical world in some ways. Are you finding among designers that they're interested in non-physical work?
Yeah, no, I mean, for sure. And I mean, I think the whole kind of debate around the metaverse, or the sort of renewed debate around the metaverse in just the past few weeks, it really gives us all a lot to chew on, and especially the fact that this idea, which was coined, in that famous book Snow Crash, as a dystopian scenario, is now being sold to us as more of a utopian one. And I think that poses questions also about really the role, the processes by which our speculations oftentimes or can become self-fulfilling prophecies, right? I mean, when we talk about science fiction, and this metaverse case is a really good example. To what extent does again science fiction become a self-fulfilling prophecy? To what extent does it act as a sort of guidebook for where we're heading, and sort of how do we feel about that? Yeah,
I guess you have the potential now to create a self-fulfilling prophecy at the Institute. Finally, COP26, the climate conference, has finished. It was kind of strange coincidence that was at the same time as our birthday celebration. But looking at the climate conference from the Netherlands, from the design community over there, what was the general census? Was it that it was a success? Was it that it was a disaster? Have the politicians got this, or is there still a lot of angst and a lot of opportunity for the design community? And how do they fit into this crisis that we face? Of course, your manifesto said there is no singularity of a solution. I appreciate that, but in the context of this crisis that has been discussed at length over the last 2 weeks, what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think Well, as every as has been widely commented, I think there's a lot of disappointment around COP26 in that it's not delivering what needs to be delivered. Although I think there's also a lot of optimism in that a lot of things were brought into the discussion that weren't before, like the phasing out, or even the phasing down of fossil fuels. At one point, here you asked about the Netherlands. At one point, the Netherlands declined to sign to sign a declaration to, I believe it was to eliminate funding for fossil fuel projects abroad. There was enough of an outcry that decision was reversed within a matter of days. So it gives reason for hope. But going back to this notion of self-fulfilling prophecies, I think both optimism and pessimism tend to be self-fulfilling. And in that regard, I think we should still nevertheless try to be optimistic and find reason for optimism, because we really have no other option.
That sounds like a good point to end on, Aric, and good luck with the optimism side of that and with your work at the Institute. Great to see you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus.